Okay, this screencast is about the genre conventions of crime fiction. Along with this screencast, there is an exercise in a worksheet in which you're asked to write a summary of this screencast, and that summary must include specific words which are included in this screencast. Okay, so genre conventions. What we mean by genre conventions is a specific set of rules that readers want a story of a certain genre to follow, to live up to. For example, the fantasy genre, we expect magic, wizards, talking animals. In fairy tales, we expect them to start with Once Upon a Time. We expect magical numbers, like the number 3. In science fiction, we expect aliens, space travel, time travel, and so on. Genre conventions create expectations, and it means that the reader recognizes the story as belonging to a specific genre when it lives up to these conventions. And at the same time, these conventions can be subverted to surprise the reader. To subvert something means to avoid, to on purpose not live up to these genre conventions. So this screencast will cover the following genre conventions of crime fiction: plot structure, character types, point of view, and lastly, the screencast will look at this subversion I just mentioned. So, the typical plot structure of crime fiction is what's sometimes called a whodunit. The mystery here is that in the beginning of a crime story, a crime has been committed, but who did it? In other words, who's done it? This creates competition between the reader and the writer, because the reader tries to solve the crime before the writer reveals the solution. It also creates competition between the detective and the criminal, because obviously the criminal doesn't want to be caught, but that's exactly what the detective is doing. This competition creates what's called suspense, this desire to keep reading because we want to know what happens. We also see certain character types that we expect to show up. For example, we expect a protagonist, someone whose side we're on. Often this is the detective. We also expect an antagonist, the enemy, the criminal, often. We also expect one of the characters to be a detective. We expect the detective to have a sidekick, someone who supports the detective, helps the detective in his or her work. A classic example of a detective and a sidekick would be Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. We also often see a client, a character that sort of starts the story by showing up and wanting to hire the detective. Quite a few detective stories also have a so-called femme fatale, which is French for dangerous woman, deadly woman. This is a character that uses her gender, her appearance, her sexuality to influence male characters, for example, the detective, and who is often a bit mysterious. We also, of course, expect several suspects in this crime story. So, point of view. Point of view refers to the way in which the story is told, the perspective from which the story is told. This often has a strong effect on the way the reader understands the story. We either see a third-person narrator, where he or she is used about the characters. This narrator, this third-person narrator, can be tied to a specific person, or it can jump between characters. We also sometimes see a first-person narrator, where I is used about the main character. Often the reader identifies with and has sympathy for this character. For example, Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes stories. He is the character that the first-person narrator is sort of tied to, and that means we don't get an intimate understanding of Sherlock Holmes. Instead, we get to see Sherlock Holmes through Dr. Watson's eyes, and we follow his attempts to understand Holmes. So, we've looked at plot structure, we've looked at character types, and we've looked at point of view. Now we'll look at how these expectations, these typical crime fiction characteristics, can sometimes be turned upside down and used against the reader. So instead of whodunit, we sometimes have howdunit as a plot structure. Here, the criminal is revealed from the start, which is unusual, and then the mystery becomes a matter of figuring out how this person did it. Prove that this person is guilty. So the competition changes, but there is still suspense. Here, expectations are subverted because the criminal is known. We can also see subversion of character types. Some characters in detective fiction don't fit these typical types. For example, in a series of novels by the writer Agatha Christie, the detective is an old lady called Miss Marple. And sometimes characters won't really expect her to be all that threatening as a detective because she's old. We see something like that in the TV show Murder, She Wrote, where the detective is not really a detective at all, but actually a writer of crime fiction, which makes her an expert in her own way when it comes to solving crime. We also sometimes see main characters that aren't detectives. For example, Dexter Morgan in the TV show Dexter is a serial killer who is at the same time a forensic scientist working with the police. We also have the TV show House, in which Dr. Gregory House is not a detective either, and he doesn't even solve crimes. He tries in each episode to figure out what is wrong with a specific patient, but it's still built up like crime fiction because there's still a mystery, still generates suspense, and he still has a sidekick. We can also see subversion of point of view. What if the first-person narrator that we're supposed to identify with and feel sympathy for ends up being an anti-hero? A person who does terrible things. What if it turns out that he or she is a serial killer, even, like Dexter? Sometimes this requires characters that are even worse than our main character, so that readers will feel sympathy anyway. For example, in the first novel about Dexter, Dexter says, "Whatever made me the way I am left me hollow, empty inside, unable to feel. It doesn't seem like a big deal. I'm quite sure most people fake an awful lot of everyday human contact. I just fake it all. I fake it very well, and the feelings are never there." So this is quite obviously a first-person narrator. And when he says things like this, it becomes sort of a conflict for the reader to feel sympathy for this character. And Jeff Lindsay, the writer, he really exploits the reader's sympathy with the character Dexter. So, in general, summing up this subversion, an author can choose to follow genre conventions or turn them upside down, depending on the effect that the author wants to achieve. Either way, crime fiction, conventional or not, still creates suspense. What changes, though, is the way that this suspense is created. It can be a howdunit instead of a whodunit, where the mystery is about the criminal's method and not his identity. We can also have unusual character types. There's still mystery, but it's solved in a different way. And the author can also play with the point of view. What if the protagonist is a serial killer? Can we feel sympathy for him? Still a mystery, we still want to understand this person and his behavior. So, now please turn to the worksheet and write your summaries.